The first time I saw the ocean turn black beneath me, I thought it was just the night sky reflecting off the water. Then I realized the surface wasn't moving at all, as if the sea itself had frozen in place, holding its breath. That was the moment I understood why there were 11 strange rules drilled into every worker who stepped foot on this rig. They weren't safety guidelines, and they weren't superstition. They were the only thing keeping us alive out here. I remember the first time I broke one of them, and I swear the shadows in the waves leaned closer, waiting. I never imagined a job could feel like a countdown, but every night on this platform feels shorter than the last. And the worst part is, I don't know what happens when the rules finally run out. When I first landed on the oil rig, the helicopter blades chopping through the salt-heavy air, I expected the usual tough guy routine from the crew. Maybe a handshake, maybe a cold shoulder, maybe a laugh at the rookie. Instead, I got a single sheet of laminated paper shoved into my hands by Victor, the rig chief. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression unreadable, and he didn't bother with introductions. He just said, "Read it, memorize it. If you want to leave this place alive, you'll follow every word." At first, I thought it was a list of safety protocols, fire hazards, drills, evacuation routes. But when I read the first line, my mouth went dry. Rule 1. Never look directly into the water after midnight. I must have smirked, because Victor's hand shot out and gripped my arm hard enough to bruise. "This isn't funny," he said, voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You think it's a joke now, but you won't when you see it for yourself. And you will see it, if you're stupid enough to look." His words sank into me like lead, but the skeptic in me fought back. I'd worked dangerous jobs before. I'd handled machines that could tear a man apart in seconds. The idea that staring into the sea could kill me felt absurd. Still, the weight of his stare kept me from saying it out loud. I folded the paper and shoved it into my pocket, pretending I'd take it seriously. The first night passed without incident. I was too exhausted from hauling gear and learning the layout of the rig to do anything but collapse into my bunk. The metal walls groaned around me, the distant hum of engines blending with the rhythm of waves. Sleep came hard and dreamless, and when I woke, the day blurred into drills, machinery checks, and shouted orders. It wasn't until the second night, standing on the deck for a smoke, that I noticed the clock. Midnight had just passed, and I was staring out at the water without thinking. The surface was calm, darker than ink, and for a second, I wondered what Victor had been so afraid of. That was when Yuri appeared at my side. He was one of the mechanics, grizzled and heavy-set, with hands like scarred steel. He didn't say a word at first. He just grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back from the railing. His grip was strong, unyielding, and when I turned to protest, his eyes silenced me. "Not after midnight," he said, his voice hoarse and deliberate. "You never look after midnight." I laughed weakly, trying to brush it off, but he didn't laugh with me. He just gave a small shake of his head and walked back inside. I stood there for a long time, cigarette burning down to the filter, too unsettled to enjoy it anymore. The third night, I forgot. Maybe forgot isn't the right word. Maybe I ignored it, just to prove to myself that I wasn't scared of superstitions. Midnight came, and I found myself leaning over the railing again, staring down into the depths. At first it was nothing, just still water, the reflection of floodlights shimmering across the black surface. Then the lights bent in strange ways, rippling without the waves moving. I leaned closer, squinting, and that was when I saw it. A face. My face. But the smile stretched too wide, the eyes too sharp, and the reflection raised its hand when I didn't. My breath caught, my skin prickling cold, and I couldn't look away. Inside, now, Victor's voice shattered the trance. He yanked me backwards so violently, my shoulder popped, and I stumbled onto the steel deck. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, and his hands shook as he shoved me through the door. "You don't ever stare into the water after midnight," he snapped. "Do you understand me? You don't even glance. Do you want them to notice you?" His words made my chest tighten. Then, he didn't say it like a metaphor. He said it like a fact. That night, lying awake in my bunk, I couldn't stop thinking about the reflection smiling up at me. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't me. By the fourth night, I was too afraid to step outside. I heard the others moving around the rig, their boots echoing across the steel walkways, but I stayed in my cabin. The walls vibrated with the hum of machinery, but beneath it, I swore I could hear something else, a low thrumming, deep and constant, like the heartbeat of the sea itself. Sleep came in fits, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin staring back from the water. I pressed my palms over my eyes until they ached, but the image wouldn't leave. The rules weren't superstition, they were survival. I knew it now, and yet part of me still wondered what would happen if someone pushed too far. On the fifth night, someone did. His name was Oleg. He was new, like me, loud and arrogant in the way men sometimes get when they're hiding fear. He joked about the rules during dinner, imitating Victor's gravelly tone, making the others chuckle nervously. But when the clock struck midnight, and he walked onto the deck with a cigarette hanging from his lips, no one followed. I watched from the mess hall window, dread settling in my gut. He leaned over the railing, blowing smoke into the night, and laughed when nothing happened. "See," he shouted. "Just stories for children." The sea stilled, the smoke drifted downward unnaturally, sucked into the black surface, as if pulled by unseen lungs. Oleg froze, staring down. His laughter stopped. I pressed closer to the glass, my pulse racing. His posture changed, his head tilting like he was listening to something. Then he whispered, soft but audible even through the glass, "She's calling me." My stomach lurched. His reflection in the water didn't move like his body. It smiled wider, its lips forming words I couldn't hear. Slowly, Oleg leaned farther over the railing. Victor's roar broke the silence. "Get him back." Two men bolted from the mess hall, grabbing Oleg by the arms just as his torso tipped over the edge. He fought them, thrashing like a madman, shouting about voices, about needing to answer. They dragged him inside, his screams echoing across the steel, until the heavy door slammed shut. I looked back at the water one last time, against every instinct, and saw the reflection still grinning up from the waves. Grinning, even though Oleg was gone from the railing. My blood ran cold. That was the night I stopped questioning the rules. After Oleg's incident, the entire rig seemed to sink into a heavier silence, as if the sea itself had claimed some part of us. He never quite recovered. They kept him under watch, assigning 2 men to stay near him at all times. But his eyes were different now. He stared at walls like they were windows, his lips twitching as if he were speaking to someone I couldn't hear. At meals he hardly ate, and when he did he chewed slowly, like the food turned to ash in his mouth. Victor didn't punish him for breaking Rule 1, but the warning hung unspoken in the air. Everyone knew what came next. That was when I noticed the second line on the list. Rule 2. If you hear your name whispered on the rig at night, do not answer it. At first it sounded ridiculous. A whisper on a rig this size. The place was all steel and machinery, every noise echoing down the halls, bouncing from wall to wall. Of course voices carried strangely. Of course you might think you heard your name when you didn't. I told myself it was just superstition layered on top of exhaustion. The others weren't so casual. They kept their radios close, their rooms locked, and their conversations low after midnight. Nobody used names at night, just nods, gestures, or the occasional grunt. The silence between words carried more weight than anything spoken aloud. I lasted 4 nights before it happened to me. I was walking the upper deck, the wind sharp and cold against my face, the metal grating ringing softly beneath my boots. Midnight had passed by an hour. The sea was calm, darker than I'd ever seen it, but I forced myself to keep my eyes forward, repeating Rule 1 like a prayer. Then I heard it, soft, almost gentle. My name carried on the wind. Alex. The sound froze me mid-step. My heart skipped, my throat tightened, and I spun around instinctively. No one was there. The deck stretched empty, the floodlights casting long shadows across steel and railing. I told myself it was the wind. That's all it could be. The air whistled through pipes and vents, bending into patterns that sounded like voices. But then it came again. Alex. Closer this time. Lower, like someone leaning just behind me. My stomach knotted. Every instinct screamed at me to answer, to say what, or who's there. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood, remembering Rule 2, do not answer. I gripped the railing, knuckles white, forcing myself to stare out at the black horizon. The voice lingered behind me for a long moment, whispering my name again and again, softer each time, until finally it faded into the sound of waves. The next morning, I told Yuri what had happened. His eyes narrowed, his mouth tightening as he set down his coffee. You didn't answer, did you? I shook my head, and he muttered something in Russian, relief softening his features. Good. If you had, they would know you hear them. Once they know, they don't stop. I pressed him for more, but he just shook his head and walked away, leaving me with a pit in my stomach. It wasn't the words that unsettled me most. It was the look in his eyes, a look that said he'd heard his name too many times. The following nights blurred into routine, but the voices didn't stop. Sometimes it was once, a single whisper drifting across the rig, soft enough to pass his imagination. Other times it came in waves. My name stretched long and slow, repeating, coaxing, as though whatever was out there grew impatient. I stopped walking the decks after midnight. I stayed inside, pacing my cabin or hiding in the mess hall with the lights too bright and the air too heavy. But even inside, I wasn't safe. The whispers seeped through walls, curling into my ears no matter how tightly I pressed my palms against them. Then Oleg answered. It was the 8th night after his first mistake. I woke to the sound of yelling, boots pounding against the metal grating outside my door. I stumbled out, blinking in the harsh fluorescent light, and saw half the crew gathered near the storage bay. The heavy door stood wide open, the wind howling through, and Oleg was gone. Victor stood at the threshold, jaw clenched, fists balled at his sides. No one dared speak, but the truth settled over us like ash. Oleg had answered when his name was called, and the sea had taken him. They never found his body, not a scrap of clothing, not a trace of blood, just emptiness where he'd once been. The crew didn't speak his name again. It was as though he'd never existed, swallowed whole by the silence of the rig. That was when I stopped doubting completely. Rule 2 wasn't a warning. It was a barrier, a thin wall keeping something patient and hungry from pulling us into its depths. A week later, it tested me again. I was half asleep in my bunk, the hum of machinery buzzing low in my ears, when I heard it. Not outside, not muffled through steel, but inside the cabin with me. Alex. The whisper was clear as day, soft and steady, inches from my ear. My blood froze. I didn't move, didn't beep, didn't dare. The voice repeated itself, this time sharper, annoyed, like it knew I was awake. My tongue pressed against the back of my teeth, desperate to respond, but I clamped my mouth shut. Sweat dripped down my forehead, my muscles screaming with the effort of stillness. The whisper came again, softer now, almost sing-song, dragging out my name. And then after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. I lay in that bunk until morning, trembling with exhaustion and fear. When I finally stumbled into the mess hall, Yuri saw me and nodded knowingly. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. His silence was confirmation enough, but the rig had grown restless, and so had whatever waited in the sea. I could feel it pressing closer with each night, testing us, probing for weakness, and when one of the men broke down and whispered back into the dark, the whole platform shook with the weight of what followed. After the night Oleg disappeared, silence became its own kind of terror. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody teased the rookies, and even during meals, the room felt strangled by the weight of unspoken dread. The men had lived with these rules long enough to know breaking them meant more than just injury. It meant erasure, vanishing without a trace into the waiting sea. I tried to adapt, repeating the first two rules like prayers in my head, clinging to them whenever fear threatened to unhinge me. But then I read further down the list, and my stomach knotted tighter. Rule 3. Always count the footsteps on the deck at night. If you hear more than there should be, do not investigate. I didn't understand it at first. The rig was massive, with at least 30 men working rotations. Of course there would be footsteps echoing across the steel walkways, especially with the wind whipping sound in strange directions. But the wording clawed at me. More than there should be. It implied the crew already knew how many footsteps to expect. It implied anything extra wasn't human. The thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit, and I told myself it was paranoia, nothing else. Still, when the first night came that I heard it, my blood ran cold in ways no storm or machine ever could. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was half asleep in my bunk when the noise started. The familiar rhythm of boots clanging on steel drifted through the walls, steady and even. At first I ignored it, assuming it was the night shift making rounds. But then another set joined in, heavier, out of sync, echoing in a strange delay like footsteps chasing after shadows. I sat up, counting softly under my breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, too many. There were too many, far more than the 3 men assigned to that section. My throat tightened, and I remembered the exact words. Rule 3. Always count the footsteps on the deck at night. If you hear more than there should be, do not investigate. The sound grew louder, filling the narrow hallway outside my cabin. I pressed my ear to the metal wall, heart hammering, and felt vibrations travel through the steel. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, moved in a rhythm that didn't belong to men. The steps dragged slightly, like wet boots too heavy to lift, and between each step came the faintest sound of dripping water. My stomach clenched as I counted again, the number climbing higher and higher until I lost track completely. My instincts screamed at me to look, to open the door and confirm what my ears refused to believe, but the rule held me back. Then came the knock. It was soft, deliberate, right against my cabin door. 3 steady raps that reverberated through the frame. My pulse spiked. None of the men knocked during the night unless it was an emergency, and even then they shouted. My name wasn't called. There were no voices at all. Just the slow, dragging footsteps shifting back and forth outside my door, pacing like a predator circling prey. I pressed my hands over my mouth to stifle the sound of breathing. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe it was only seconds. But eventually the footsteps receded, fading into the distant hum of the rig. I didn't sleep again until dawn. The next morning, I tried to explain to Yuri, careful not to sound insane. His eyes sharpened instantly. You counted, he asked. I nodded. And you didn't open the door. I shook my head. His shoulders sagged with relief, and he muttered a prayer under his breath. Good, they knock because they want you to open. Once you do, you're gone. No struggle, no sound, just gone. His certainty chilled me deeper than the night itself. I pressed him for more, but he turned away, muttering about rules older than the rig itself, rules written in salt and steel. That night, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, maybe exhaustion had played tricks on me. But as the clock ticked past midnight, the footsteps returned. This time I wasn't alone. I was in the mess hall with 3 other men, Victor included, playing cards just to pass the hours. The sound echoed from the deck above, heavy boots clanging in uneven rhythms. We froze, eyes flicking to each other, silently counting. There were too many, far too many. Victor raised a hand sharply, silencing the whisper rising from Yuri's lips. The footsteps circled, slower now, like they knew we were listening. Then the lights flickered, a single pulse of darkness before stabilizing again. Victor finally spoke, his voice low but firm. Stay seated, no matter what you hear. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward the stairwell that led down into the mess hall. My pulse pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. The sound stopped just beyond the door, silence pressing heavy against us. Then, as if to test our will, the knock came again. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and patient. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit frozen, staring at the steel door, separating us from whatever waited outside. Victor's hand pressed down on the table, steady as stone, his jaw set. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Finally, the footsteps receded once more, dragging themselves back into the night. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victor collected the cards, his hands trembling slightly, though his face remained stern. "Now you know," he muttered. "Count them. Always count them. If there are more than there should be, you pretend you don't hear." His eyes lingered on me, heavy with unspoken warning. I nodded, though my mind screamed with questions I didn't dare ask. The rules weren't just superstition. They were bargains, boundaries. And something out there was testing how close it could push before we broke. The third time it happened, I almost failed. I was alone on maintenance duty, walking the lower deck with a flashlight when the sound began. At first it was only 2 sets of footsteps, me and Yuri above me, then 3, then 4, then dozens, echoing in every direction, filling the steel corridors until I couldn't tell where I was or how many there really were. My breath quickened. I started to run, but no matter where I turned, the footsteps followed, dragging and wet, slamming into the walls with unnatural rhythm. My flashlight flickered, casting long warped shadows across the steel. I stumbled into a corner, pressing my back against cold metal, whispering the rule again and again in my head. Do not investigate, do not open, do not. The footsteps stopped all at once, leaving only the hiss of my own breath. Then slowly, deliberately, I felt pressure against the door in front of me. A knock, soft and patient. My flashlight flickered out. In the dark, I swore I heard water dripping just inches away. My hand hovered over the handle, every instinct screaming to open it and end the suspense. But I clenched my fists, digging nails into my palms until they bled. The knocking faded. The footsteps withdrew. When I finally stumbled back to the mess hall at dawn, Victor's expression told me he already knew what I had endured. By then I didn't need convincing. Rule 3 wasn't just another warning. It was the only thing standing between us and something that wanted to be let inside. And I knew, with a sick certainty, that sooner or later someone wouldn't resist. After the ordeal with the footsteps, sleep became almost impossible. Every clang of steel, every groan of the rig's massive structure, sent my nerves into overdrive. I found myself repeating the rules in my head, like mantras. Don't look into the water. Don't leave your door open. Count the footsteps. Never investigate. It was the only way to steady my breathing. But as much as those nights terrified me, I knew I hadn't even reached the worst of the list. That came when I read Rule 4. Never answer the radio after midnight. The voices you hear are not your crew. I tried to convince myself it was nonsense. The radios were lifelines out here, our only connection to each other across different decks, and to the outside world when the weather was clear. I told myself maybe it was a way to keep rookies from staying up all night, joking on the comms, but the phrasing didn't feel like discipline. It felt like warning, and when you're stranded in the middle of the Black Sea, cut off from civilization, you start to believe warnings. My first encounter came sooner than I expected. I was on night rotation, tasked with checking the auxiliary generators near the stern. It was around midnight, the air thick with salt and mist, when the static of my handheld crackled to life. The voice was faint, broken by distortion, but it froze me instantly. I lifted the radio, pressing the button. "Say again?" My voice shook slightly. The reply came clearer, low and trembling. "It's Oleg. I'm trapped, below deck." My blood went cold. Oleg had been gone for a week. Everyone knew he wasn't coming back. I glanced around the empty corridor, heart hammering. The rational part of me screamed that it couldn't be real, but the desperation in that voice felt unmistakable. "Please," it begged again. "You have to open the hatch." My thumb hovered over the transmit button. Then I remembered the rule: never answer the radio after midnight. The voices you hear are not your crew. I lowered the device slowly, breathing hard. The voice grew more frantic, shouting now distorted by static. "I'm dying down here. Don't let me die alone." Each plea drove nails into my chest, because it sounded exactly like him. The same accent, the same rasp. I wanted to run, to check the hatches, to at least prove to myself it wasn't real. But something deeper, something primal, kept me rooted in place. Then the voice changed. Mid-sentence, it shifted pitch, stretching and cracking like something trying on a sound it didn't quite understand. "Please, don't leave." The final word broke into a guttural hiss before the radio cut to silence. The next day, I told Victor what I'd heard. He stared at me for a long moment before replying. "It knows who you miss," he said flatly. "That's how it gets you. Makes you think you can save them, but it isn't them." I asked him what it wanted, but he just looked toward the sea and said, "To be answered. Once you do, it comes through." He wouldn't elaborate further, no matter how much I pressed. A week later, I nearly forgot the warning. I was on late duty in the control room, the radios lined up in a neat row, their green lights glowing faintly in the dark. Midnight came and passed quietly. Then at exactly 12:15, the far left radio hissed alive. "Yuri, it's me. I need you on deck 3, now." The voice was calm, confident, unmistakably Victor's. My stomach lurched. I grabbed my watch. Victor was below, asleep in his bunk. I knew because I'd just passed his cabin minutes before. Still, the voice repeated, sharper this time. "Yuri, don't make me ask again. Deck 3. Yuri, who had been half dozing at the console, bolted upright. His hand twitched toward the radio, but I grabbed his wrist hard. "Don't," I hissed. He blinked at me, confusion clouding his face. "But that's Victor." The voice spoke again, more insistent. "Deck 3. Now." I could hear faint footsteps in the background of the transmission, heavy and wet, as though someone were sloshing through shallow water. Yuri's face went pale, and slowly he pulled his hand back. The voice fell silent, leaving only the low hiss of static behind. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the shift. The third time, it came for me personally. I was alone in my cabin when the handheld crackled awake. The voice that slipped through wasn't Oleg or Victor. It was my sister's. She called my name in that soft, familiar way, the way she used to wake me up for school when we were kids. My chest tightened painfully. She wasn't here. She was hundreds of miles away, safe on land, but the sound was so perfect, I almost believed it. "Please," she whispered, "talk to me. I'm so cold." My throat burned as I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to answer. "If you love me, you'll say something." The voice pressed, growing sharper, crueler. I stuffed the radio under my pillow until it smothered into silence. By then I understood what the rule really meant. It wasn't just about safety, it was about survival of the mind. The voices knew things they shouldn't. They twisted familiarity into bait, dragging memories to the surface like hooks, and the moment you bit, the moment you answered, you let them inside. Nobody explained how, but I could feel it in my bones. Then came the night Yuri broke. We were in the control room again, another dead shift past midnight, when the radio blared louder than ever before. "It's Victor," the voice said, perfectly clear, not a shred of distortion. "Yuri, something's wrong with the generator. Get down here now." Yuri's eyes went wide. He looked at me, hesitated, then grabbed the receiver. "I'm on my way," he said, before I could stop him. My stomach dropped. His words had barely left his mouth when the lights flickered violently, plunging us into shadows. The radio screeched, not Victor's voice anymore, but a layered chorus of wet, guttural sounds. Then silence. Yuri stood frozen, the radio still clutched in his hand, his face blank. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe in a way that felt human. I shouted his name, shaking him, but his body stayed rigid. Finally, he turned his head toward me with a slow, unnatural motion. His eyes were empty, glassy, like something was looking out through them instead of him. Without a word, he walked out of the room, the radio dangling loose in his hand. I never saw him again. That was when Victor gathered us all and made us swear on blood never to touch the radios after midnight again. His voice cracked with something I'd never heard before. Fear, we all agreed. We all knew, the sea wasn't just outside the rig, it was inside too, seeping through static and steel, waiting for someone to slip, and one by one, it would take whoever listened. The nights since then have been worse, filled with static whispers threading through the walls. I've learned to stuff cotton in my ears, to sleep with my back turned to the glow of the radios, but still, sometimes, just before dawn, I swear I hear my sister's voice calling faintly, promising warmth if I'll only pick up, and each time I have to remind myself of the rule, because once you answer, you're no longer here. I used to think of my cabin as the only safe place on the rig, a small steel box where I could at least pretend the walls kept the night away. But after Yuri vanished, that illusion cracked. The silence in the corridors felt heavier. The shadows in the corners seemed to breathe, and I realized the rules were never meant to protect us from the outside world. They were to protect us from what was already here. I remembered flipping back to Rule 5, always bolt your cabin door before you sleep. If you hear scratching, do not open it until sunrise. The simplicity of it was deceptive, almost childish, until I experienced it myself. The first time the scratching came, I thought I was dreaming. It was a faint, irregular scrape at the bottom corner of my door, like nails dragging over steel. My body went rigid under the thin blanket, heart slamming against my ribs. At first I told myself it was a rat, or maybe rust grinding in the wind, but then it came again, deliberate, slow, as though testing the strength of the barrier. Every nerve in me screamed to move, but the rule echoed in my mind, bolt the door, don't open it. So I lay still, counting my breaths until dawn's pale light crept through the porthole. When I finally dared to check, the paint around the bottom of the door was scratched raw, claw marks etched into the metal, like something had been trying to crawl inside. I kept the secret to myself until the others started hearing it too. Pavel, one of the deckhands, stormed into the mess hall one morning, looking like death, eyes sunken in red. He swore something had whispered his name through his door all night, begging him to unlock it. He laughed nervously while telling the story, but his hands shook so badly, his spoon clattered against the bowl. Victor leaned across the table, his face hard. You kept it bolted? Pavel nodded, then admitted he almost didn't. It sounded like my wife, he said softly. Nobody touched their food after that. That night, I bolted my door tighter than ever. Midnight passed in heavy silence. Then it started again, soft scratching at first, growing louder, faster, until it sounded like claws raking in fury. My breath caught as something heavy pressed against the door, the frame groaning under the weight. Then came the whisper. Not a voice I recognized this time, but low and gravelly, words stretched like they didn't belong in a human throat. Let me in. My eyes squeezed shut, every muscle taut. The door shook violently once, twice. Then everything went dead quiet. I didn't sleep at all. Days blurred after that, exhaustion clawing at my sanity. Some men broke quicker than others. I overheard Anton, one of the engineers, arguing with himself in his cabin through the thin walls. His voice rose and fell, first angry, then pleading, as if someone stood outside bargaining with him. The next morning, his door was wide open, his bed empty, and deep gouges scarred the floor, leading out to the corridor. We never found him. Victor said nothing, but the look in his eyes told me this wasn't the first time. The worst came on a storm night. Rain hammered the rig so hard it sounded like bullets against steel. The wind wailed through the pipes, drowning every other sound except the scratching. This time it was furious, relentless, like a beast enraged by the storm. My door shook violently, bolts rattling in their sockets. Then came a new sound, metal bending. I stared in horror as the bottom edge of the door began to peel outward, just slightly, as if something was prying its way through with inhuman strength. A foul stench seeped in, sharp and briny, like rotting fish left in the sun. I backed into the corner, hands shaking, whispering the rule to myself over and over: don't open it until sunrise. Don't open it. Don't open it. At some point I must have blacked out from fear, because I woke to weak sunlight and a silence so deep it felt sacred. The door was warped at the bottom, the steel twisted and scarred, but the bolts had held. On the floor outside, just barely visible through the crack, were long streaks of something dark and wet dragged down the corridor. I never asked what it was. I didn't want the answer. The crew grew thinner each week. Some disappeared without a sound, others left behind doors hanging open. The bolts snapped clean through. Victor tried to rally us, insisted we double-check each other's doors every night, but I could see his own hands tremble when he set his locks. One evening, as we walked back to our cabins, he pulled me aside. "They're testing us," he whispered. "Every night they get stronger, but the bolt still keeps them out." His eyes darted to the shadows at the end of the hall. For now, it was almost sunrise when the scratching came for me the last time. It was different that night, slower, more patient, as if whatever was outside had all the time in the world. Then the whisper came again, and this time it wasn't gravelly. It was my mother's voice, soft, tender, the way she used to wake me as a child. "Open the door, darling. Just a moment, that's all." My chest tightened so painfully, I nearly broke. Tears burned my eyes, and for one insane second, I reached for the bolt. My hand hovered there, trembling, until a violent slam rattled the door, and a second voice cut through, deeper, mocking. "Yes, darling, let us in." I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat, realizing they weren't even trying to mimic anymore. They didn't need to. They knew I was breaking. I spent the rest of the night, pressed into the corner, whispering to myself until dawn finally bled through. When I dared open the door, the walls outside were clawed so deep I could see bare steel shining beneath the paint. That was when I stopped thinking of the cabin as safe. The bolts weren't protection anymore. They were just buying us time. And each night, the things outside grew bolder, their scratches louder, their whispers sharper. I don't know how long the bolts will last. All I know is that the moment one fails, none of us will make it to morning. By the time I reached Rule 6, I was already unraveling. The bolts kept the things from getting inside, but the rig itself felt like a prison suspended over something far worse than storms or shadows. It was the sea, vast, endless, blacker than ink, that had begun to gnaw at me. At first, the rule sounded absurd, almost laughable. Never look into the water after midnight. What could possibly be more harmless than a glance at the waves? But I remembered what Victor said the first week. The rules aren't warnings, they're barriers. Break them, and the sea decides if you live. The temptation to test it grew like an itch. Nights stretched into an eternity of scratching doors, whispering voices, and the constant groan of steel straining against waves. Sometimes I found myself standing by the porthole, staring at the rolling blackness below, my reflection faint in the glass. The surface seemed to shift unnaturally, forming patterns too symmetrical to be waves. I forced myself away before midnight struck, whispering the rule like a prayer. Still, curiosity clawed at me. What was in the water that could scare men more than the things scratching at our doors? One evening, Pavel stumbled into the mess hall, pale and wide-eyed. His hands shook as he lit cigarette after cigarette, inhaling so deep it made him cough. "I saw her," he muttered. We asked who, and his eyes filled with tears. My sister, she was there in the water. She waved at me. She looked alive. His voice cracked, but none of us comforted him, because all of us knew Pavel's sister had died 3 years ago. The table went silent, every eye darting to the portholes, then away again. Victor's voice broke the stillness. You looked after midnight. Pavel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next night, Pavel was gone. His door stood wide open, bolt untouched, bed cold. We searched everywhere, deck, cabins, engine room, but found only wet footprints leading toward the outer railing. They stopped there, abruptly, as if he had stepped willingly into the sea. None of us spoke of it again, but I couldn't shake the image of his hollow eyes, the way his voice trembled when he swore his sister had called him. It wasn't just whispers outside doors. The sea itself was hunting us. After Pavel vanished, I grew terrified of the windows. Even during the day, I avoided looking too long at the rolling surface. At night, I kept the curtain shut, refusing to let my gaze wander. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I swore I saw shapes moving below. Not shadows of fish or debris, but long, fluid silhouettes twisting unnaturally, keeping pace with the rig. Once, I swore I saw something pale press against the glass of the porthole in the hall. A face, bloated and distorted, grinning with teeth far too many to count. By the time I blinked, it was gone. One stormy night, I almost broke the rule. The winds howled so violently that I couldn't sleep, and the rig pitched like a drunken giant. Something slammed against the hull, not once, but over and over, hard enough to make my cabin shake. Against all reason, I staggered to the porthole and almost pulled the curtain aside. I froze, hand trembling inches from the fabric, as I remembered Pavel's voice, the way he said she looked alive. My heart hammered as I whispered to myself, never look into the water after midnight. I stumbled back to my bed and clamped my eyes shut until dawn. But not everyone resisted. A week later, Anton, the same engineer who had once argued with himself in his cabin, confessed he had seen lights beneath the surface, glowing softly, like lanterns drifting in the deep. They're beautiful, he said in a distant voice, as if still mesmerized, like they're calling me home. Victor's face turned pale at the words. That's not light, he snapped. That's bait. His warning came too late. The following night, Anton was gone. This time, there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, just the sound of water slapping against the rig, steady and hungry. By then, my paranoia had become unbearable. I taped shut the edges of my curtains, shoved blankets against the cracks, anything to block the sea from my view. Still the sounds came. Late into the night, I would hear soft rhythmic splashes against the steel, like hands slapping the hull, climbing. Sometimes a faint voice drifted up through the porthole, muffled and wet, whispering my name. Once, I swore it came from directly beneath my floor. I pressed my hands to my ears, whispering the rule again and again, but the voices bled through the silence. One dawn, I made the mistake of walking the deck alone. The sea was calm, deceptively so, glass smooth beneath the rising sun. I told myself it was safe to look, just this once, since it wasn't after midnight. But as I leaned over the railing, my stomach dropped. The water mirrored the sky, too perfectly, not a ripple breaking its surface. And then I saw them, faces, dozens of them, pale and translucent, staring up at me just below the waterline. Their eyes were black voids, mouths hanging open in eternal screams. My knees buckled, and I stumbled back, nearly collapsing. By the time I blinked, they were gone, the sea rolling lazily, like nothing had happened. I didn't tell the others, not right away, but Victor seemed to sense it anyway. That night, as we sat in silence in the mess hall, he leaned close and muttered, "They're waiting, they're patient. You break the rule once, and you're theirs." His face was grim, his voice shaking for the first time. The sea doesn't forgive. I wanted to ask how he knew, but the hollow look in his eyes told me he had already seen too much. The worst came on the night of the red moon. The air itself felt wrong, thick and metallic, as if charged with unseen current. None of us slept. Around 2 in the morning, I heard Victor shouting from the deck. I rushed out, and there he was, clutching the railing, staring into the black water below. His knuckles were white, veins bulging, as if some invisible force held his gaze. I grabbed his shoulder, shaking him, but his eyes were glassy, unblinking. His lips moved, murmuring words I couldn't hear over the roar of the sea. For one terrifying moment, I thought he would climb over. I slapped him hard, again and again, until finally his eyes blinked, and he gasped, stumbling back from the edge. "It almost had me," he whispered, collapsing against the wall. His voice was raw, broken. "It looked like her. My wife. She was down there smiling at me." I pulled him back inside, bolted the door, and neither of us spoke for hours. But I knew then, the sea wasn't just showing us illusions. It was reaching into our minds, pulling out memories, twisting them into bait we couldn't resist. Now I don't even step near the portholes after dark. I keep my back to the water, curtains taped, ears covered, but every night, I hear it calling. Sometimes it's a voice I recognize, sometimes a stranger's, always soft and coaxing. And though I've kept the rules so far, I know one slip, one glance too long, and I'll vanish like the rest. The rig groans as if it knows, as if it feels the weight of whatever waits beneath. And I can't help but wonder how long before the sea grows tired of waiting for us to break the rule, and comes to collect us anyway. By the time we reached Rule 7, sleep had become a luxury none of us could afford. The rig itself felt alive, groaning and shifting, as if straining under invisible weight. Every night, new sounds drifted through the halls, mutters, scraping, sometimes even laughter that didn't belong to anyone still alive. But the most terrifying thing came in silence. When we stepped out on the deck after dawn and saw them wet, glistening footprints trailing across the steel. At first we thought it was Pavel, or Anton, or the others who had vanished. But Victor shook his head, face grim. "No," he said, "it's the sea, and if you follow you'll never come back." The rule was clear, never follow the footsteps on the deck. The first time I saw them, they were fresh, water still pooling in the grooves of the steel. Bare feet, human-shaped but oddly elongated, toes curled like claws. They stretched from the railing near the starboard side, across the deck, and vanished into the shadows near the storage bay. My gut twisted with a strange pull, as if my body wanted to follow even while my mind screamed no. The footprints looked ordinary enough, but the silence surrounding them was suffocating, unnatural. Even the waves seemed to hush, waiting. I forced myself to step back, whispering the rule under my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling the footprints were watching me. Not everyone resisted. That night, Sergei, one of the younger crew, burst into the mess hall, eyes wild. "I heard him," he stammered, shaking. "My brother. He was calling for me out there." Victor shot up, slamming the table so hard the mugs rattled. "You saw the prince, didn't you?" Sergei didn't answer, just stared at the floor, sweat dripping down his temples. We tried to keep him inside, but later, when the storm raged and the rig shuddered, we heard the metal door slam. By the time we reached the deck, Sergei was gone. Only the wet footprints remained, leading away into the shadows until they faded into nothing. After Sergei, we kept the doors locked at night. Still, the prince came back. Some mornings they were small, like a child's. Other times, massive, each step filling with seawater that refused to dry. Once I saw a set that seemed to circle the rig endlessly, as though something had walked around us all night, waiting. Each print seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, as if the sea itself had pressed its weight into the steel. None of us spoke while we scrubbed them away, hands shaking, praying not to hear the voices calling us to follow. One evening, I stood by the galley window, watching the deck sway under the moonlight. The shadows twisted strangely, stretching longer than they should have. That's when I saw them again. Footprints forming slowly, step by step, though no one was there. The deck was empty, yet the prints appeared as if invisible feet were walking across it. My chest locked tight. I forced myself away, refusing to watch where they led. But later, when I lay in bed, I swore I heard wet footsteps stop outside my door. I held my breath until morning, never daring to open it. The crew grew restless, paranoia eating at us. Victor repeated the rule, every chance he got, but the others whispered that maybe the prints were a path to freedom, a way off the cursed rig. One night, Oleg the cook confessed he had followed them once, just to see where they led. His voice shook as he said, "They stop by the edge, and if you look over the railing, something's waiting." He refused to say more, only muttered that it had his mother's face, smiling up at him. From that night on, Oleg never left the kitchen. A week later, we found his apron on the deck, soaked and heavy, trailing into fresh prints that disappeared over the side. I tried to stay strong, but the prints haunted my dreams. I saw them in endless rows, leading me across the rig, down into the Black Sea, where pale hands waited to drag me under. Sometimes, I'd wake to find myself standing by the door, hand on the latch, as if sleepwalking. I started tying myself to the bed with rope, just to keep from wandering. Still the urge lingered, gnawing at me every time I heard the faint slap of wet feet echoing in the hall. One night, during a storm, I made a mistake. I forgot to bolt the door before sleep. At some point, I woke to the sound of water dripping. When I opened my eyes, the floor was wet. Footprints stretched across my cabin, leading from the porthole to the door. My stomach dropped as I realized they weren't mine. Heart pounding, I forced myself to follow them with my eyes, but not my feet. They stopped just outside my door, where the lock should have been fastened. That's when I realized the prints hadn't led into my room. They had led out. I told Victor the next morning, my voice shaking. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "They're trying to lead you back to the water. They'll use any door they can." His face was pale, older than I remembered. "Don't ever follow, no matter where they lead, even if they walk into your own bed." His words lodged deep into me, twisting like hooks. I didn't ask how he knew. Some truths were worse than ignorance, but the worst came soon after. One foggy dawn, I woke to hear the entire crew shouting. I ran to the deck, and there they were, hundreds of wet footprints covering every inch of steel. Small ones, large ones, twisted ones that looked more like claws than toes. They overlapped, crisscrossing, circling the rig like a swarm. It was as if an entire crowd had walked across us in the night. Some led to the railings, others to the cabin doors, and one trail stopped right at my boots. The prints glistened with seawater, fresh and dripping, though the air was dry. I felt something then, a pull stronger than before. My body wanted to move, to step into those prints and follow them wherever they led. My muscles tensed as those strings pulled at them, dragging me toward the railing. Only Victor's hand on my shoulder snapped me back. His grip was iron, shaking me hard. "Don't look at them," he barked. "Don't follow, that's how they take you." His voice was desperate, as if fighting his own urge. Together we backed away, but the prints seemed to pulse, glistening in the fog, waiting for us to slip. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of my cabin, rope tied tight, staring at the bolted door, while whispers drifted from the hall. "Come," they said, voices of people I knew, people long gone. My hands shook as I muttered the rule again and again, each repetition like a shield. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until it felt like someone was breathing just behind my ear. When I finally dared to glance at the floor, I saw the prints again, wet, fresh, circling my bed. And that's when I realized the footsteps weren't just on the deck anymore. By the time we reached Rule 8, the rig felt less like a machine and more like a trap designed to grind our sanity down piece by piece. Days blurred into nights, the sea unchanging, the horizon always empty. But if there was one place on the rig worse than the deck with its cursed footprints, it was the engine room. The rule was simple: never enter the engine room after midnight. At first it sounded like paranoia. The engines were the heart of the rig. Why would anyone avoid them? But when I heard what happened to the last crew, I understood. The story came from Victor, told in a hushed tone, late one night while the storm battered us outside. "Engines don't stop at midnight," he said, eyes shadowed. "But down there past 12, it isn't the engines you'll hear." He leaned close, lowering his voice, so only I caught it. "They say you'll hear voices in the pistons, whispers in the grinding metal. If you follow them, you won't come back the same." His words lodged into me like ice. I tried to laugh it off, but the fear in his eyes was real. And fear, I had learned, was never wasted here. The first time I had to go down during the day, I understood why the rule existed. Even with sunlight above, the engine room was a cavern of shadows. Steel walls sweated with condensation, pipes hissed, and the air was hot enough to choke. The machinery throbbed like a heartbeat, pounding through the soles of my boots. Every sound echoed too long, too loud, as if the walls wanted to hold on to it. When I leaned close to check a gauge, I swore I heard a faint whisper in the hiss of steam, like someone exhaling words just out of reach. My chest tightened until I fled back up the stairs. That night, lying in my bunk, I couldn't stop hearing it, the echo of that whisper. My mind replayed it, stretching it into words. I tried convincing myself it was nothing, just nerves. But sometime after midnight, when the rig was quiet and the waves lulled, I heard it again. Faint, metallic, a voice rising through the floor. It was calling my name. My blood froze. I pressed the pillow over my ears, heart hammering. The rule screamed in my head: never enter the engine room after midnight. I prayed nobody else heard it, but someone did. 2 nights later, Anton vanished. He had been restless all evening, muttering about fixing a pressure leak, though Victor insisted everything was stable. Around 1 in the morning, the alarms shrieked. We ran to the control panel and saw a hatch open, warning light, engine room access. By the time we reached it, Anton was gone. His wrench lay on the floor, slick with condensation, as if he'd dropped it mid-step. The engines throbbed louder than ever, their rhythm strange, offbeat, like a chant. We called his name, but the only reply was the hiss of steam and the grinding hum of steel. After Anton, the fear doubled. We locked the hatch each night, bolting it from the outside. But still, the voices carried. They drifted up through the floors, soft at first, then sharper, more insistent. Some nights they mimicked Anton's voice, other nights my mother's. Once I could swear I heard Sergei, the boy who'd vanished on the deck. Each voice begged in a whisper, pleading for us to come down, just for a moment, promising answers in the dark. I stuffed cloth in my ears, but even then, I felt the vibrations in my bones, like the rig itself was speaking. One night, exhaustion got the better of me. I drifted into a half-sleep, only to wake with a start, sitting on the edge of my bed, boots already laced. My hands were trembling, as if they'd tied themselves. And then I heard it again, the call. This time it wasn't muffled. It was right outside my door, sharp and clear. "Come below." My breath caught in my throat. I yanked the rope that held my door shut, praying it would hold, and whispered the rule like a mantra. When I dared glance at the floor, water had seeped in under the doorframe, carrying the faint vibration of footsteps pacing outside. Victor saved me that night. He dragged me out at dawn, shaking me hard, demanding to know if I'd listened. His eyes burned into mine. "Never answer them. Never," he growled. "That's how they win. They'll wear you down, wait until your mind cracks, then pull you under." I wanted to ask who they were, but the words stuck in my throat. Some questions didn't have safe answers here, but the engine room didn't stay quiet for long. The next storm brought chaos. At midnight, alarms blared again, warning of overheating below. We knew better than to open the hatch, but the control gauges spiked dangerously, threatening a meltdown. The crew panicked, shouting over each other, demanding action. Victor stood firm, refusing to break the rule, but then a sound silenced us all, knocking, deep and slow from beneath the floor. Not metal against metal, something deliberate, rhythmic, like a fist on a door. Boom, boom, boom. The engines roared with each strike, shaking the entire rig. We huddled together, frozen, listening to that dreadful pounding. Then came the voices, layered and countless, rising in a chorus from below. They didn't whisper this time, they screamed. Names, pleas, laughter that scraped the edges of sanity. I covered my ears, but the sound rattled my skull, clawing into me. The hatch trembled, as if something was pressing against it from the inside, trying to get out. We held it shut with our weight, bolts groaning, praying the steel would hold. Hours passed like years before the storm broke, the voices fading back into the machine's grind. By morning, the hatch was warped, dented outward, as though something massive had slammed it from within. We didn't speak of it, just welded the lock shut and painted over it, pretending it didn't exist. But that night, when I lay in my bunk, I felt the hum again, deeper, more insistent. And then I realized with a sick twist in my gut, the vibration wasn't coming from below anymore. It was rising through the walls. The voices had found another way in. By the time we reached Rule 9, sleep had become a luxury none of us could afford. The nights were no longer silent. They were alive, pulsing with sounds that did not belong to the sea. At first it was easy to dismiss, the groan of metal, the churn of waves. But soon the calls began. At precisely 3 a.m, faint voices drifted across the water, so human, so familiar, that your heart ached to respond. The rule was clear. If you hear someone calling your name from outside the rig at night, do not answer. But temptation is a cruel thing when you are stranded in endless darkness. The first time I heard it, I nearly gave in. It was my sister's voice, soft and trembling, carrying through the black waves. "Please help me," she begged, her words broken by sobs. I froze at the porthole, eyes locked on the horizon. There was nothing out there but the pitch of the sea. My hands shook as I reached for the latch, ready to throw it open. That's when Victor grabbed me by the wrist, twisting hard until pain jolted me back to reality. "It isn't her," he growled, his face pale and damp with sweat. "It never is." The second time, it was Anton's voice. This one nearly shattered me. "It's cold," he whispered from below the deck, just loud enough to carry upward. "I'm trapped. Please let me in." My throat tightened. I wanted so badly to believe it was him, lost in the engine room, begging for rescue. But then I remembered how his voice had been stolen before, woven into the hum of the engines. If the rig could mimic Anton down there, why not out here too? I whispered the rule again and again, until the voice faded into the waves. But not everyone resisted. Pavel, the youngest of us, lasted only a week after the calls began. His mother's voice woke him one night, sweet and warm, singing a lullaby he remembered from childhood. I woke to the sound of the hatch creaking and rushed out just in time to see him climbing over the rail. His face was serene, almost blissful, as if he were stepping into a dream. We shouted, but he didn't even look back. He let himself fall, arms spread, vanishing into the dark water without a splash. The sea swallowed him whole, and the lullaby continued for hours afterward, echoing across the waves. That broke something in all of us. After Pavel, we tied ourselves to our bunks at night, wrapping ropes around our chests and wrists, so we couldn't wander even half asleep. Still, the voices pressed on, louder now, more insistent. They knew our weaknesses, our secrets. One night, Sergei's lost laughter carried over the water, playful and mocking. Another night, I heard my father's stern voice, ordering me to come outside immediately. The cruelty of it was unbearable. Each voice was sharp enough to cut deep, yet soft enough to make you doubt your own mind. The storm that came next nearly drove me over the edge. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the waves like rolling mountains. The rig swayed and groaned, as if ready to collapse. In the chaos, I heard it again, this time my own voice. It came from the water, calling upward with perfect mimicry. "Help me, I'm drowning. Please." My knees buckled as I clutched the railing, staring into the frothing sea. To hear yourself begging for your own life. There are no words for the sickness it brings. Victor yanked me back once more, eyes wide with horror. "They've learned you," he hissed. "You're next." From that night on, I avoided windows and portholes entirely, keeping curtains drawn tight. But avoidance didn't save me. The voices changed tactics, growing bolder. Instead of calling from afar, they began whispering right outside the bulkhead, inches from where I slept. Some nights, I could hear knuckles rapping lightly on the metal, followed by my name drawn out in a hiss. The rope around my chest was the only thing that kept me in place. I lay stiff in bed, heart pounding, whispering the rule over and over like a prayer. The others weren't so strong. One by one, they frayed under the pressure. I watched Ivan pace the hall one night, sweat dripping from his brow, as he fought the urge to answer his wife's voice, calling from the sea. He clawed at his ears until they bled, just to drown it out. The next morning, he was gone. His bunk empty, his rope neatly cut with a blade. Outside the water was calm, too calm, as if it had swallowed him peacefully. No splash, no struggle, just silence. And then came the night. The voices worked together. Instead of one familiar call, dozens rose up at once, a choir of the damned. Every person we'd lost sang out from the sea, their words blending into a sick harmony. Anton, Pavel, Sergei, even Ivan, all of them, calling, pleading, laughing. The sound was unbearable, rising to a pitch that rattled the rig. The steel beams groaned, as if bending beneath the weight of it. I pressed my hands to my ears, until my head ached, but the chorus thundered inside my skull. That was when the realization struck me, like lightning. The sea wasn't just calling, it was celebrating. It wanted us to join them. By dawn, 2 more bunks were empty. The survivors sat hollow-eyed at the mess table, refusing to speak. Nobody had the strength to ask why. Victor finally broke the silence, his voice rough as gravel. "They're not trying to lure us anymore," he said. "They're thinning us out, one by one." His gaze flicked to me, sharp and heavy. "You must hold. If you give in, we all go." His words weighed on me, more crushing than the sea itself, because deep down, I knew he was right. That night, I slept with my eyes open, rope tight enough to cut into my skin. Still the voices came, my name, again and again, until it no longer sounded like my name at all. It became a chant, low and rhythmic, shaking the walls. The rig seemed to lean toward the sound, tilting with the pull of their call. I bit my tongue, until I tasted blood, forcing myself silent. But the hunger in those voices grew, as if they knew the endgame was near. And then just before dawn, something changed. The voices stopped, not faded, stopped. For the first time in weeks, silence blanketed the rig. It was worse than the calls. The sea was too still, too calm, waiting. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay listening, every nerve stretched thin. That's when I realized something was moving outside, slow and deliberate, circling the rig, not a voice this time. Footsteps, heavy, wet footsteps sloshing against steel, pacing just beyond the bulkhead. They no longer needed to call from afar. They had come to the door. The silence after the voices vanished was a silence I had never known before. Not peaceful, not calm, something else. It pressed against my ears like a weight, so thick it felt unnatural. For nights the sea had tormented us with cries and laughter, with the desperate calls of those we'd lost. Now there was nothing. That emptiness was more terrifying than any sound, because it meant only one thing: the rules had shifted. We all knew Rule 10 would come into play soon. We whispered it in the mess hall like a curse. Never open the main deck hatch after midnight. No matter what you hear, The hatch was our one true lifeline to the outside. During the day, we used it to check the rig's structure, to haul up supplies from boats that occasionally braved the Black Sea to reach us. At night, it was our weakest point. A single steel door between us and the endless dark. Victor always double-locked it before sundown, checking the bolts twice with trembling hands. But locks only work if you don't turn them yourself. And after what we'd heard at the bulkheads, the fear wasn't of something breaking in. It was of us letting something inside. The first test came quickly. At 12:17, the footsteps returned. I was in my bunk, tied as usual, but the sound was unmistakable. Slow, heavy steps sloshing against the deck, pacing toward the hatch. Then came the knock. Not frantic, not aggressive, measured, deliberate. 3 thuds, evenly spaced, like someone keeping time. My throat went dry. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The knock came again. This time it was followed by a voice. A deep, tired voice I recognized instantly. "It's Sergei. Let me in." My heart nearly stopped. Sergei had been gone for weeks, swallowed by the storm and the voices, but the sound was perfect. His cadence, his accent, even the rasp in his throat when he was exhausted. Victor shook his head furiously, whispering through gritted teeth, "Not him, not him." The knocking grew louder, more urgent. "Please, it's freezing out here." They left me behind. My fingers twitched against the rope around my wrists. Every instinct screamed at me to open the hatch, to drag him back to safety. But the rule burned in my mind like fire. The voice outside shifted. It wasn't Sergei anymore. Now it was Pavel, then Ivan, then my sister. Each one took its turn, begging, pleading, demanding. The hatch shook as fists pounded harder, rattling the bolts. I could see the steel quiver in the dim light, the hinges groaning under pressure. But still, the locks held, and we held. Hours passed in torment, the voices never relenting. Just before dawn, the noise stopped. When Victor dared to approach the hatch, he pressed his ear to the cold metal and listened. His face drained of color. "They're waiting," he whispered. The following night, they came back, but this time they didn't knock. They scraped. Long, slow drags of nails, or claws or something worse, screeching down the metal like someone carving their way through. The sound drilled into my skull until I wanted to tear at my ears. Then came the whispering. Dozens of voices, all at once, weaving together in a maddening chant. My name over and over, rising and falling like waves. I bit my tongue until blood pooled in my mouth, whispering the rule again and again. Victor sat against the hatch with his shotgun, but his hands shook so badly I doubted he could fire if he needed to. On the third night, things escalated. The hatch didn't just rattle, it bulged inward, steel groaning as if something massive leaned against it from outside. The bolts strained, threatening to snap. We scrambled to reinforce it, dragging chains and metal bars across, anchoring it with whatever we could find. All the while, the voices screamed, cried, laughed, and begged. They used every trick. Some sounded like us. I heard Victor's own voice demand to be let in, furious and commanding. He paled at the sound, clutching his weapon tighter. The sea was learning, adapting. It knew we were weak, and it pressed harder every night. But the worst came at 2:46 a.m. That was when the hatch handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately, as if someone on the other side already had the key. We watched in horror as the steel handle twisted against the locks, straining to break free. Victor threw himself against the door, screaming at us to hold the bars in place. I pressed with all my weight, my muscles burning, sweat pouring down my face. The handle jerked violently, over and over, each pull stronger than the last. The hatch thundered under the assault, and I swore it would give way. But then silence. Just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. That silence carried into the fourth night. No knocking, no scraping, no voices. The hatch was still and quiet, as if nothing had ever touched it. That should have been a relief, but instead it filled us with dread. We gathered in the mess hall, whispering about what it meant. Ivan's empty chair stared back at us like an accusation. Victor slammed his fist against the table. "They've changed tactics," he muttered. "That's worse. That means they're waiting for us to slip." His words gnawed at my mind as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear the faintest sound from the hatch. The waiting was torture. Every creak of the rig, every groan of metal felt like the beginning of another attack. I began to dream of the hatch, of it slowly opening on its own, light spilling out onto the deck, shadows moving inside. I woke each time drenched in sweat, convinced I'd hear the bolts snapping, but each night, the hatch remained shut. Each morning the sea stared back at us, calm and endless. That waiting was worse than the pounding, worse than the voices. It was like sitting beside a loaded gun, knowing the trigger would eventually pull itself. The breaking point came 5 nights later. The storm returned, lightning flashing across the horizon. Waves pounded the rig, making the steel groan and shudder. In the chaos, I heard it again, the sound of the hatch handle turning. I ran to the deck, Victor already there, bracing himself against the door. "Help me," he shouted. I threw my shoulder into the steel, feeling the violent jerks pulling against us. But this time, there was something different. Between each crash of thunder, I heard a new sound, a slow, steady creak, not of the handle, but of the bolts themselves beginning to bend. The realization hit us all at once. It wasn't just a trick, not just voices anymore. Whatever was outside had grown stronger, strong enough to break through. Victor's eyes met mine, wild with fear. "If it gets in, none of us survive," he whispered. We pressed harder, every muscle screaming, the storm roaring around us, and then just as lightning split the sky directly overhead, the top bolt snapped. The hatch jolted inward an inch, a black gap opening at the seam. The wind howled through it, carrying with it a stench so foul I gagged. Rotten brine, copper, and something animal, something alive. And in that instant, something pushed from the other side. Not a hand, not a claw. Something I cannot describe, wet and writhing, forcing its way through the gap. The top bolt snapped with a sound that made my stomach turn. It wasn't just metal breaking. It was a promise breaking, a rule straining under the weight of forces we never should have tested. Victor screamed for us to hold the hatch, but the gap widened with every push from outside. That stench grew stronger, curling into our lungs until I felt bile rise in my throat. I couldn't see it clearly, only a glistening mass shifting just beyond the seam, slick and pulsing. My body wanted to recoil, to run, but instinct rooted me in place. The rules had prepared us for this moment, and I knew exactly which one would follow if the hatch gave way. If dawn comes and the hatch is open, do not look at what is inside. We had never spoken much of Rule 11. Even Victor, who carried the rules like gospel, avoided it when he could. "You'll know if it comes to that," he would say, his voice heavy with a fear he tried and failed to hide. The others joked about it sometimes, nervously, as if mocking the rule would make it less real. But none of us truly wanted to know why it existed. Tonight, as the bolt screamed under strain, and the hatch bent inward like a lung collapsing, I realized the rule wasn't just a warning, it was an inevitability. Sooner or later the hatch would open, and dawn would come. The storm outside roared louder, wind lashing us with salt spray that somehow slipped through the cracks. Lightning bathed the deck in ghastly light, and in one brief flash I saw the thing on the other side of the hatch. Just a glimpse, enough to know that whatever pushed was not human, not animal, not even wholly of this world. Its surface rippled like skin stretched over water, faces bubbling up only to melt away. My knees buckled, and I almost fell, but Victor's grip on my arm yanked me back upright. "Don't look," he roared, though I had seen enough to know his warning came too late. We fought the hatch until our muscles failed, until every breath was fire in our chests. Another bolt snapped, and then another. The door shrieked open just a fraction wider. A wet tendril slipped through, sliding across the deck like a serpent, searching, tasting. It brushed my boot, and cold spread up my leg. Not physical cold, but something deeper, something that gnawed at the marrow of my bones. I kicked it away in blind panic, and it recoiled, only to press harder against the gap. Victor raised his shotgun, fired point blank into the seam. The blast echoed through the rig, deafening, but whatever was outside didn't scream. It didn't bleed, it only paused, as if amused, before pushing harder. By 3:30 a.m., the hatch hung on a single bolt. The gap was wide enough to show slivers of what writhed beyond. Too wide, shapes pressed against the opening like eager children peering through a crack in a door. Some were faces, familiar and unfamiliar. Sergei's eyes blinked at me, swollen and glassy, his mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong to him. Behind him, something vast pulsed, its rhythm sickeningly like a heartbeat. We layered more chains across the hatch, but it was useless. The steel bent inward, groaning with every shove. The rules had warned us. They had always warned us. We were simply reaching the end. The hours between 3 and 5 crawled like centuries. The storm waned, the sea calming to an eerie stillness, but the assault on the hatch never stopped. Sometimes it was violent, slamming against the door so hard the rig shook. Other times it was gentle, almost coaxing, as if whatever waited outside wanted us to open it willingly. Once, when exhaustion dragged me to my knees, I heard my sister's voice again, whispering through the crack, "You can end it if you just look." I pressed my palms to my ears, shaking my head, but the words burrowed in deep. Every rule I had followed so far had saved my life. But now, in the endless darkness, I wondered if resisting would only prolong our suffering. Then at last, the eastern horizon began to pale. Dawn crept across the Black Sea in soft bands of color, washing the rig in gray light. The storm clouds parted just enough to let it through. I staggered to the hatch, chest heaving. The bolts were gone, the chains stretched and useless. The hatch stood ajar, no longer held by our hands, but by something else, something that wanted us to see. Light touched the gap, illuminating the wet gleam of what writhed beyond. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. Victor gripped my shoulder, his eyes bloodshot, his lips trembling. "Remember the rule," he whispered. "If dawn comes and the hatch is open, do not look at what is inside." But it was impossible not to look. The light spread, creeping over the deck, sliding into the opening like a searchlight. Shadows danced, impossibly long, stretching across the steel. I squeezed my eyes shut, but curiosity gnawed at me, more dangerous than fear. What could be worse than what we had already endured? What secret was so terrible it demanded blindness? Around me, the others shifted, torn between obedience and temptation. Then I heard it, Victor's sharp intake of breath. I turned my head, too late. His eyes were open, his gaze fixed on the thing inside. His scream tore through me, raw and animal, before cutting off in an instant. When I dared to glance, Victor was gone, not dead, not dragged away, just gone. His shotgun lay on the deck where he had stood. His boots were empty, toppled over like discarded props. The space where he had been was filled with nothing but faint mist curling toward the hatch. My stomach lurched. I fell to my knees, clutching the ropes still tied to my wrists, my whole body trembling. The others whimpered in terror, some clenching their eyes shut, others staring blankly ahead. The light grew brighter, burning against the hatch, and with it came a sound unlike any I'd heard before. A chorus, not screams, not whispers, something larger, older, vast as the sea itself. I pressed my forehead to the deck, eyes sealed, repeating the rule in my head like a prayer. Do not look. Around me, I heard movement, footsteps staggering closer to the hatch. Someone had given in. Someone had to see. Their gasp was sharp, followed by silence. When I opened my eyes again, They too were gone. The deck was emptier, but the air was heavier, charged with a presence that pressed into every corner of me. Dawn continued to rise, golden light spilling across the sea, but it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like revelation. The hatch stood wide now, fully open. Beyond it, I could sense, not see, never see, something vast, something endless, stretching beyond the boundaries of the rig, of the sea, of the world itself. My body screamed at me to look, to know, to finally understand what had stalked us through the nights. I clenched my eyes tighter. The air trembled, the deck groaned. One by one, the others vanished into silence, claimed by the light or the thing within it. I was the last, alone, trembling, blind, repeating the words until my voice broke. If dawn comes and the hatch is open, do not look at what is inside. And so I didn't. Not then, not ever, but the hatch never closed again. And dawn always comes. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.